Everybody, welcome back to the channel and welcome to a brand new crash course. In this crash course, we are going to learn all about React testing library. And essentially, this is a library that will allow us to write test scripts for our React applications. Now, in this crash course, we are going to be building and testing this very simple application. So the reason why I'm doing a very simple application is because, well, I want to introduce React testing library, but this application over here, which is a simple counter application, is actually kind of deceptive in the amount of tests that we actually have to write. So it's kind of a good introduction to React testing library. So what is this counter app doing? Well, you can imagine over here we have the counter, and we can basically add to the counter or subtract to the counter. So what we can do is we can basically add. So over here we're adding 1. So now you can see that this is changing. We can also subtract 1, and you can see here that this is also changing. Now we can also basically change by how basically these steps, how much do we want to increase or how much do we want to decrease. So we can change this to something like 7. And then we can do 7, and then we can also subtract by 7. And let's go ahead and change this to, like, let's say 20. Now, if we go above 100, you can see that the color changes to green. And if we go at negative 100 or under, you can see that the color changes to red. So this is a very simple application. We're not really going to focus on actually writing the application, but we're mostly going to focus on actually going ahead and testing it. Now, why in the world do we even care about writing a bunch of tests for this application? We basically, kind of, in a sense, just tested it right now, and it seems to be working perfectly fine. Actually, what we did right now is something known as manual testing, where we actually go ahead and play around with the software and test if it works okay. Because right now, let's say I expect this to be 79. Well, it works perfectly fine. If I change this number to, let's say 1, I expect this to be 120. It works perfectly fine. I just implemented a bunch of manual testing. With React testing library, we are implementing a bunch of automated testing. And essentially, automated testing is a way of testing where we write scripts basically saying that, hey, this feature in this component should work a certain way. Why do I care about that? Well, let's actually look at a diagram to kind of explain why we want to take this approach of the automated testing over the manual testing approach in the long term. So again, we have two different approaches. We have manual testing. This is where we actually test out our software manually. So I'm testing right here. This should be 121. There we go, 121. And then there's automated testing. Automated testing is when you actually write code, test scripts that basically test your software through these test scripts. And essentially, it triggers some sort of action and it expects some sort of outcome. So this is what we are going to be focusing on with React testing library. Now, why in the world would we want to basically focus on this over this? This seems like a lot of work. And actually, writing the tests for this is going to take maybe 3 times the amount of work than actually writing the functionality for this. So it seems like this is a lot of work that we could have just done by just quickly manually testing. Well, here's the reason why we want to manually test, or test in an automated fashion over manual testing. So let's say that we have an application. So right now we're working with a very simple application, very simple. But in a real production application, our software is going to be very complex, and it's going to have multiple parts to it. So let's say that this is a React application, and it contains multiple components. So over here, there's multiple components. And within each component, we have multiple features. So over here, we got multiple features within each component. So let's say what we want to do is for this component over here, we want to add an additional feature. So right now we have feature A, B, C, and R, and we want to add an additional feature. Essentially, we're going to modify the code base in some sort of way. So we could add an additional feature or remove an additional feature or update additional feature. We're just modifying the code base for this particular component right over here. Now let's say we want to add an additional feature. So we change the code base in some way. Let's go ahead and let's add another feature in. So let's say we want to add feature Z. So we add feature Z. Now what we can do with this pretty big application is if we go about the way of automated testing, what we can do is we can basically, manual testing, what we can do is basically check if this component is working fine. Okay, that's great. This component is working fine. That's terrific. So we can basically say, okay, we're done this feature. Now here is kind of an issue that arises. Let's say that we implement feature Z and feature Z is broken. Well, when you're actually going ahead and actually writing it, you probably can catch that feature Z is broken and eventually you can fix it. So there we go. You can fix it. Manual testing rules. So now let's say that you add feature Z and it unintentionally breaks feature A. So you add something into your code base that actually affects the functionality of feature A. Now it's highly likely that you might not catch this. Now let's say you're focusing on this component and you see that something is breaking within this component, and you go ahead and you look around, you see what's going on, you figure out that okay, feature A is breaking, and you go ahead and fix it, and that is fine. So here's one thing, with automated testing, we'll be able to catch the error right away. Whereas with manual testing, you might actually not catch this error, but let's say you're focusing on this component, so it's easy for you to catch this error. So let's say another scenario right now. Let's say you add feature Z, and it unintentionally breaks feature I in a completely separate component. Now here it is very, very likely that you don't catch this error, because right now you're focusing on solely on this component and this component working properly. You're not looking around at all of the other components. So what you can say is, oh, this is terrific, this is fine, this works perfectly okay, so I'm going to go ahead and push this into production. This is great. But then this component over here has features that is failing because of the code that you added. Now, that is the problem with manual testing. When we have a large scale application, it is almost impossible to go ahead and check every single component and see if it is working properly. Now, with automated tests, what we can do is for each feature, we can write a specific test. We can say that, hey, I expect this feature to work in this way. I expect this feature to work in this way. Now, if I go ahead and write this test and it ends up failing feature I, then what I can do is basically run all my test suites, and then my tests will tell me, hey, this feature over here is failing. So right away, I can go to this feature, and then I can start to figure out why this feature is failing. And that right there is why we want to use automated tests over manual tests. So over here, I kind of have a list of things that trump manual testing. As I said, manual testing is error prone. Remember, error prone in that, hey, we can write this test and completely forget about some of the errors that occur in other components. Also, manual tests are very, very time consuming. Yes, in the beginning, automated testing might be more time consuming because you're writing the tests, but in the long run, when you are writing new features, if we had to do manual testing for every single component, especially as our application is getting larger, this can get very, very tiresome. So this is why, again, automated tests can just go ahead and tell us directly that this feature right here is failing. And so in the long run, it is very, very less time consuming, if you will. Over here, also, automated tests tell us exactly what went wrong. Whereas with manual tests, we might have to do a little bit of digging around to figure out, hey, this feature is going wrong. Manual tests tell us exactly that feature I is breaking and exactly what is happening that is breaking. And we're going to actually see that with our application. And then over here, automated testing actually can serve as documentation, which is really good for new developers. Actually, a lot of the times, these senior developers tell these junior developers, hey, just look at the tests. They kind of serve as documentation because they're written so well. And basically, you can see how the software is supposed to work. So that is another advantage of automated testing. And that is exactly why we are going to be using React testing library to test this application. So that is kind of the introduction. Let's go ahead and create this over here and go about testing it. To test out our React application, we are going to follow a methodology known as test-driven development. And essentially in test-driven development, what we do is before actually implementing a new feature, we write tests testing whether that feature works or not. Now initially, of course, we haven't implemented the feature, so those tests should fail, over here symbolized as red. And then after we write the test, what we do is we actually write the bare minimum amount of code needed for our tests to pass. And then we basically test our test suite again, and there we go. Now we have a running test. So with test-driven development, if we want to add an additional feature, we first write the test, testing the functionality of that feature, and then we code it out so that test passes. And then once that test passes, we are done and we can move on to another project or another feature. So this is test-driven development. Again, we write our tests before actually developing our application. Now, why would we want to do this? Well, there's actually a few good reasons why we would want to do this. One good reason is that if we went ahead and just coded out our application, we can just write tests that make it just pass based on the application that we coded out. Whereas maybe beforehand, we actually had a bunch of different functionalities that we actually wanted to implement. So if we wrote our tests first, we can have a clear idea of what exactly we want, and then we can write out the code that is needed to make those tests pass. Another reason is test-driven development forces us to write tests. If we went ahead and just created a component and then decided to test it out later, it's very easy to kind of neglect testing. What could happen is maybe you could create a component and you could be like, okay, let me add on to this component before I test, and all of a sudden now it's a very, very big component that requires very, very extensive testing. And you can also maybe you can kind of forget about it and actually work on a different feature, and now you don't have any tests for this component over here. So this is why we are going to take the test-driven development approach, and this is very, very common among large tech companies. They heavily use this approach over here of testing their software applications. And so this is what we are going to do to develop this simple application. So to test out a React application, we first have to create a React app. And if you're taking this crash course about React testing, I'm assuming you have a good to fundamental knowledge of React itself. So I'm just going to quickly explain how to create a React app, but this is something I kind of expect you to already know. So in your terminal, just go to whatever directory that you want to place your React app in and do npx create React app. And then you can do space and call whatever you want to call your React app. So we can say React testing. And so this is the command that will allow us to create our React application. Now I'm not going to run this because, well, this command takes forever and I already did create a fresh React app, but if you haven't, then go ahead and run this. Also, you need to have Node installed if you want to use the npx command. So if this fails for you, it's probably because you don't have Node installed. So go ahead and install it, and then you should be able to do npx. So there we go, we can create our React app. Now once you have your React app, what you can do is you can go ahead and open that React app in your favorite text editor. I am using this text editor, VS Code, which is very, very popular and commonly used among almost every single programmer. And so this is the React or editor that I'm using to open up my React application. And you can go ahead and actually run your application by doing npm start. So you can go to your terminal. Let me quickly zoom in some more. Let's zoom in actually a little bit more right now, just so everybody can see things clearly. You can go into either your basically Mac terminal or the built-in VS Code terminal, and you can do a npm start, and that way you can actually run your React application. So now, because I stopped it, it should theoretically not be running anymore. So if I enter, I guess it is still running. But yeah, it's running on localhost port 3000. So that right there is how we can create our React application. Now let's get React testing library inside of our fresh React application. So ultimately what we want to do is we want to have two instances of React running, one on localhost 3001 and one on localhost 3000. Essentially, ultimately, we want to make this React application exactly the same as this over here with a bunch of tests. Now, the first thing that we have to do is, because we're following a test-driven approach, we have to somehow get React testing library into our React app. So over here, you can see the command npm install -- save dev and then add testing library -react. However, we actually don't need to do that, because we created our app with create React app. So if you created your React app with create React app, essentially you get support for React testing library right from the get-go. So there's actually absolutely no installation that you have to do. And to kind of prove this to you, in the new fresh React application, what we can do is we can actually go to the package.json, and over here we can see that we have @testing libraries, and this is basically the React testing library right over here, and these are kind of the dependencies that we installed. And actually, if we go to our source directory, we can see that we have an app.test.js, and we can see here that, well, React has actually written our first test. And don't worry about this, we will get to all of the syntax in great detail, but we can actually go ahead and run this test if we can open up a brand new terminal, and we can do something like npm run test. Now, why do we do npm run test? Again, if we go to our package.json, we can see that we have a test script, and this is essentially going to test all of the tests inside of our application. It's going to run all of the tests inside of our application. Now, how is it going to know, well, where our tests are located inside of our application? Well, inside of our source directory, any file that is appended .test.js is going to be treated as a test file and is going to be executed. So right now it is going to execute app.test.js, but if we were to create another test, another file called lathe.test.js, it will also execute that, and it doesn't have to be in the root directory, it just has to be somewhere inside of the source directory. So let's go ahead and let's run this test, and we should in a second see that our first test is passing. And essentially what this test is doing is it's saying that, hey, learn React should be located somewhere inside of, well, the app right over here. So let's actually go ahead and let's manipulate this. Let's do app.js, and let's just say, instead of learn React, we'll say learn Vue. And then if we now run this exact same test, we can actually see that the test is failing. So this is our first initial test. We're actually going to delete this and kind of do this from scratch. But this is how we can set up our React app, and we can actually run our tests. And it's great that React testing library comes right off the gate if you do create React app. So this is basically what we have right now. Let's actually do a little bit of cleanup so we can have something somewhat similar to what we have over here. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to just completely get rid of this test right over here, because we don't need this anymore. So we can actually remove this. And now if we go ahead and you can see here, it looks for changes, and now it's saying, hey, there's no tests that exist because there is no files with the .test extension. And let's just do a little bit more cleanup. Let's just get rid of this SVG, this logo.svg. Let's remove that. Let's go to the app.js. Let's remove the import for the SVG. We'll leave the CSS because we're going to use that a little bit later. And then we can just completely get rid of all of the elements within this. And now what we have is pretty much a bare bone HTML or React application, literally nothing, which is kind of similar to what we have here. All we have additionally is this component. So that is a good setup. Let's actually go on to the next section where we are going to be creating our first test and implementing our app. So let's go about and write out our very first test. Now the very first feature that we are testing is a very simple one. Essentially, we want to basically have a header over here saying my counter, and we want to test that that header exists and it has the correct content. So essentially that is the very first thing that we want to do. We essentially basically want this header to display right over here, and we want to test if it exists and it contains the correct content. Now for this very first feature, we are not going to follow a test-driven development approach. We're actually going to create it and then we are going to test it. And the reason for this is because this is our very first test. I want to quickly introduce all of the terminology and all of the imports and all of the things of that nature first. And then after we have a good grasp of that, for every other feature, we are going to follow a test-driven development approach. So let's actually go ahead and do this right about now. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to go to our source directory and create our component. So in here, I'm going to create a new folder called counter. And then in here, I'm going to create a file called counter.jsx. Now you can either use JS or JSX, doesn't matter. And then what we can do is we want to make this basically some sort of functional component. So we can go ahead and copy our app component and we can paste it in there, and we can get rid of the app CSS and instead do an import React from React. So we can import React from React. Let's make sure I spell React correctly. And then what we can do is we can change this to counter. We can also change this over here to counter, and we can get rid of this class name. So we can get rid of this class name. And then over here, let's just create an H1, and then over here we have my counter. And now let's render this on our app.js. So let's go ahead and let's import counter from ./counter and then counter.jsx. So let's go ahead and let's render our counter component, and there we go. We can see our counter. Now this is a little bit big, so let's actually change this to an H2. Let's save that. Okay, there we go. It looks close enough. Actually, let's change it to an H3 just to make the styles work a little bit better. Okay, there we go. So we created this, and essentially we just manually tested this. We saw that it works. Let's actually go about and create an automated test for this. Now for things like this, it might not even be needed to write tests, but let's do this just so we can actually introduce tests and how we can go ahead and write them. So to write tests, if you want to test a specific component, what we can do is we go to that folder where the component is housed, and we create another folder known as __test__. And then in here, we create the test, basically the test file that's going to test this specific component. So this is going to be counter.test.js. Now if we go ahead and create it, you can see that now our test suite is basically running basically all of the tests in this file. Now this file doesn't contain any tests, and that's why we have a fail. It says that your test suite must contain at least one test, and well, over here it doesn't. So let's go about and let's essentially do everything that we need. Let's do all the boilerplate to write our very first test. So the first thing that we need to import is, well, React from React. And the reason for this is because we are testing a React component. And, well, we need React to be able to test a React component. So over here, we are going to get React from React. And then we want to basically get the component that we want to test. So over here, this is going to be the counter component. And so this is going to be in the /counter directory right over here. So this is the component that we want to test. Now the next thing is essentially we want to be able to render the component in some sort of virtual DOM. So essentially every single time our React suites are ran, that component is rendered on some sort of virtual DOM, and essentially then all of the tests will be executed based on that virtual DOM. Now to be able to render our test in a virtual DOM, we basically need a method known as render from at testing library-react. Now, again, if you created your app with create React app, you can go to your package.json and you can see that, well, we have this already. So there we go. So now the last thing that we have to import is something that is very known to Jest, known as the expect keyword. And we'll actually see what this does in a moment, but just take my word for it, we need to import this. So over here, we can do something like at testing library dash extend expect. So this will allow us to use the expect keyword, and we'll see exactly what this does in a moment. So let's go ahead and let's write out our first test. Now, if we want to write out our test, we have to specify the test keyword, and this is a function that is going to be executed. Now, in here, we can basically pass two parameters. So the first parameter is a string symbolizing essentially, or rather describing what the test is doing. So our first test is basically testing if, well, this exists. So essentially, we're going to say header renders correctly with correct, or header renders with correct text. That's going to be describing our text. And then the second parameter is going to be basically a function that is going to have all the logic for our test. So this is where we're going to have most of our logic, or actually all of our logic. So let's go about and let's do this. So the first thing that we have to do is we actually have to render this component right over here, our counter component. And we can basically get that using the render method over here. So let's go ahead and let's say const component is equal to render, and we want to render our counter component. So there we go. We went ahead and we rendered it. And now what we want to do is, now that this component is rendered in our virtual DOM, we basically want to check if this element over here contains basically the text of my counter. Now there's multiple different ways that we can get a specific element. And to actually see them, you can do something like component.getBy, and you can see all of the different ways that we can get a specific element. You can see here we can get by alt text, we can get by text, we can get by role, we can get by title, we can get by element. There's multiple different ways. But the absolute best approach is to actually go to the component and give the component that we want to test a specific ID known as a data test ID. So we can give this a data test ID, and we can call this data test ID, let's say header. And now we can save this. And then over here we can say, I want to essentially get the component by test ID. And well, what is that test ID? Well, that ID is the header. So now what we can do is we can do something like const header element is equal to component.get by test ID. And what test ID well do we want to get? We want to get the header. So now what we can do is we can assert some sort of test, and we do this with the expect keyword. And again, expect, this is why we did this import over here, so we can use the expect. So now what we can say is that, hey, I expect that the header element dot text content, so basically this element over here, it's text content, and I expect that to be, so to be, and this is outside of the expect, I expect it to be my counter. So we can paste that in there. So I expect it to be my counter. And if I go ahead and run this, you can see that it successfully passes. Now if I change this to say, let's say I make some sort of mistake and I say instead of I misspell counter, we can save this, and now it's cooter. And you can see here that it's failing. And it actually tells us exactly what is failing. It's saying, hey, I expected counter, but instead I got cooter, and you can see here that we're missing an N. So it's specifically telling us that we're missing an N. So we can go ahead and we can update that because we ran our test successfully. And there we go. We have ran our very first successful test. Now let's just do a little bit of cleaning up. So over here you can see what we're doing is we're doing component is equal to this over here, and then we're not using component itself, but we're using a method inside of component known as getByTestID. So instead of doing component.getByTestID, what we can simply do is just destructure out getByTestID. So we can just destructure out getByTestID, and we can just get rid of this component over here, and then we can go ahead and save this, and it should execute just fine. All right, so that is our very first test. I hope that kind of explains all of the imports. In the next sections, we are going to actually go ahead and code out this entire application following a test-driven development approach. Alright, so now let's do a little bit more testing. For this section, all we're going to do is just essentially create all of the elements. That's what we want to do, and we want to make sure that they render correctly with the correct values. So we are going to follow a test-driven approach for this. So let's go ahead and let's write a test for this over here. So essentially we are going to expect this value right over here, and initially we're going to also expect this value to be 0. So this is our counter. Let's write our very first test for this. So let's go ahead and we're going to say test, and we can basically say counter initially starts at 0. So initially starts with text of 0. So this is our first test. This is going to be, or our second test rather. This is the description of that test. And essentially over here, we're going to go ahead and write out this test in a test-driven development approach. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to do const, and we want to essentially get by test ID. And we want to render our component. So for each test, it is going to re-render the component. And so we're going to render this component. And then we essentially want to get the element that contains that counter. Now again, over here we haven't created it, but let's say when we create it, we're going to give it a test ID of counter. So we can say something like const counter element is equal to get by test ID of counter. And then what we can do is something very similar. We expect the counter element dot text content to be, and we expect that to be 0 initially. So there we go. Now we can pass, or we can run this test, and this test should pass, but this one should fail. And over here you can see here that this fails, and the reason why it fails is this, hey, I don't have an element called counter. And this makes sense because, well, we haven't created this yet. We are again following a test-driven approach. So let's go ahead and now let's create basically the tests for this over here. So for these kind of buttons right over here. So essentially, let's begin with the input. So we want to basically say that the input exists and its initial value is 1. You can see here that initially it starts off at 1. So let's write a test for this. So we're going to say test dot input contains initial value of 1. So that's basically what that is. And just to kind of prove that to you, if I refresh this page, you can see it initially starts off as 1. This isn't a placeholder. This is an actual text or actual value. So we can say something like this. We can let's go ahead and let's do const get element by ID. Again, we want to render our DOM. So we want to render our component, our counter component. And then let's go ahead and let's get the input element. Again, we haven't created this yet, but let's assume that we give it a test ID of just simply input. So we can say input element is equal to get by test ID of input. And then over here, we're going to have an expect. And over here, what we're going to do is something a little bit different. Now you can fall into the trap and say, okay, input dot element dot text content to be 1, so that you can actually fall into this trap. But however, you have to understand that input doesn't contain text content. It actually contains values. So instead of text content, what we do is input element dot value. So just dot value to be 1. Again, let's go ahead and let's save this. Again, both of them should fail. So now let's just do these buttons right over here. So let's, of course, we want to write the tests for these. So let's say add button renders with correct text, or we can say it renders with plus sign. So let's go ahead and let's do that. And then over here, let's actually just copy and paste this over here, because it seems like we're doing this for every single test. Now, if there are certain things that are similar with every single test, there's actually an approach that we can do that basically kind of minimizes the repetitive code. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but for now, we'll just do it this way. So we can say add btn, and we can say get by test ID, and let's say we have an element with a test ID of add btn. And let's actually change this to add button, and let's change this to add dash btn. And then over here, we're just going to assert that we expect that the add btn dot text content to be a plus. And now we can do the exact same thing for our subtract. So let's just copy this, and then over here we can just say subtract, and this is minus. And then over here we can say subtract. So this is going to be add subtract. Of course, over here we have to change this to subtract. And over here we're going to expect that the subtract btn dot text content to be a minus. So there we go. We have basically created all of the tests. And now you can see that 4 tests are failing and then 1 test is passing. And this is actually, this kind of methodology is known as red-green testing. And essentially that's because, hey, we're getting a bunch of red tests and then we want to write out our functionality so that, you know, they can go from red to green. So let's go ahead and let's write out our functionality to make these tests pass. The first thing that we want to do is let's go ahead and let's make this test pass over here. So in here, we can basically create an h2, and this is going to have an initial value of 0. So let's do a class name, and then let's do something like, or actually not a class name, let's do data test ID. And remember, this data test ID is going to be of counter. Now, this value over here is always going to change, so it's actually better that we put this in a state right away. So let's go over here and let's import use state. So use state. We're just going to say const counter value. And then over here, we're going to say set counter value. This is just basic React. I do expect you to know this. Counter value. And then over here, we can do use state. And initially, we can set that as 0. So over here, what we can do is we can basically have that over here, the counter value, which is initially 0. So if we save this, theoretically, now we should have 2 passing tests, and that's exactly what we have. All right, so that is that first one. Let's actually make the rest of the tests pass. So now let's create a button. Let's create a subtract button first. So over here, this is a subtract button with a minus. Let's give this a data test ID of subtract btn. Let's make sure that the naming is absolutely correct. Or add subtract. Okay, see, that's not good. Let's change this to subtract btn, and let's copy that, and then let's paste that in there. So subtract btn. And then, well, that's pretty much it. So now we can actually save this, and we should expect our another test to pass. Okay, cool. So now we can do the exact same thing, but with add this time. So we can add btn. Cool. So now we should have another test passing. And now let's go ahead and let's create a input. And this is going to be of type number. And then let's also give this a data test ID of, well, I think we called it input. All right, so we're going to give this a data test ID of input. Now, let's just make sure that that's exactly what we called it, input. Now it's failing. And the reason why it's failing is, well, we expected this to be 1, but initially it's nothing. And if you actually go back over here, we can see that it's completely nothing. So now what we have to do is we have to basically pass in some sort of value. Now this value can always change, so it's actually, again, a better practice to use some sort of hook, a use state hook. So we can say that the input value, so the input value, and we can basically set the input value, and that can be equal to use state, and initially it's going to be equal to 1. And so now we can go ahead and we can basically pass that in there, and now we should have all of our tests passing. That was from some previous error that we had, but there we go. Now all of our tests are passing. So there we go, we have it. Now, one thing that I do want to change is, well, I want to make the text content of this to be right in the middle. So simply to do that, all we have to do is we can just add a counter.css file, and then we can say something like text center, and we can do text align center. We can import that CSS file into this component. Let's do counter.css, and let's say here we're going to give this a class. This is getting a little busy. Let's actually make this multiple lines, and then we'll just say class name of text center. It's kind of like a bootstrap class. So now if we save this, this shouldn't reflect any of our testing, but just for styling purposes, that's how we have it. Okay, so that is pretty much it. So now in the next section, let's actually make this functional, because right now we can't really do anything. Nothing is happening. We can't even change the value because it's actually fixated at 1. So there's actually multiple things that we have to do to make this completely functional, and we're going to get to that in the next section. So far, this is what we have created, and right now it is completely infunctional. We can't add, we can't subtract, we also can't even change the input value. But basically all that we did thus far is create the UI elements and essentially tested that the initial renders are correct. Like, you know, this initially rendered with 0, this initially rendered with a value of 1. But now let's actually go ahead and let's go and write the tests for the functionality of this right over here. So for instance, you know, when we click this, we should expect this to go up. If we change the value to 6, we do expect it to go up, or go up by 6. We also would expect it to go down by 6 and things of that nature. So let's actually go about testing this. Now there's multiple things that we would have to do, and so let's actually break them down into multiple little tests. The first thing that we absolutely need is, well, we need to be able to change this value right over here. So let's actually go ahead and let's just write a test saying that, hey, a person is able to change this value to, well, whatever the value is. So if I were to change this to, say, 9, well, I'm able to change it to 9, and then that value over here for this element is 9. So let's write a test for that right now. So let's go ahead and let's do this. So let's go to our test, and then we can say, well, we want to write a test. We want to say changing value of input works correctly. So that's going to be just describing our test. So over here, let's go ahead and let's actually just copy this. So we're gonna basically, again, render our component, our counter component, and let's basically get our input element. Now we actually already created this over here. So remember, we created it and we gave it a data test ID of input. So let's actually go ahead and get it. So let's do const input element is equal to, this is going to be get by test ID of input element, or just of input on its own. So input. So now what we want to do is we want to, well, trigger some sort of event. So now we don't just want to see, whether this component exists or whether this component initially has a value. Now we actually want to, well, implement some sort of event, some sort of change. And what is this event? Well, we want to be able to essentially change this value from 1 to, let's say, 5 or 6 or whatever. Now, how do we kind of do this in a testing environment? Well, we can do this by going over here and getting a new method known as FireEvent. And well, this right here initially, well, really all it does is it fires a specific event. So let's actually go ahead and use it, and it'll be really clear how this works. So we can do FireEvent, and then we can basically append what event that we want to fire. So over here we have like different types of events. We have a click event, a copy event, whatever, a drag event. So there's multiple different types of events. We're not going to focus on all of them. Actually, we're only going to focus on 2, but there's multiple different events that you can use. Now, the event that we are going to use is the change event. So essentially what we want to do is we want to change this value from 1 to something else. So that is the event that we are going to use, the change event. So let's go ahead and we're going to call this, and then we're going to basically specify essentially the input element that we want to change. So what is this input element? Well, this is this input element right over here. So essentially we want to change this input element. So we can basically paste it. And then what do we want to change about it? Well, we want to change its value. Now remember, if we ever wanted to extract a value of an input element, it would look something like this: e.target.value. So e.target.value. So essentially what we want to do is we want to change the target, and then we want to change that value to, let's say, 5. So we want to change that value to 5. And so once we fire this event, what we basically can do now is we can basically expect that the input element dot value to be, well, 5. So now if we actually go ahead and execute this, well, it's going to fail because right now we actually can't change the value to 5, and that's why it's failing. Another thing that we can actually do is we can have multiple expect statements. So we can basically have an expect statement right over here, and we can basically say that initially we expect it to be 1, and then over here we expect it, after we fire our event, we expect it to be 5. Now this is still going to fail because, well, we can't really change our functionality at this moment because we can't change our input. It's basically stuck at 1. So there we go, we have created this very first test. So let's actually go ahead and, in a test-driven approach, let's actually fix it and let's make this functional. So this is very, very easy to make this functional. All we really have to do is say on change, let's call a function. And this function is going to basically take the e right over here. And we're essentially going to set the input value to whatever e.target.value is. So let's go ahead and save this. And now you can see that our test passed. Okay, cool. So now let's work on another piece of functionality. So now we can actually do this and it changes appropriately. So now let's work at another piece of functionality. Now let's say that when I click the plus button, it should reflect on the counter over here. So let's go ahead and let's write a test for this. So let's go here and let's say clicking on plus button adds 1 to counter. So adds 1 to counter. Then over here, let's have our function. Similarly, let's take this over here and let's paste that in there. And then what are we doing? Well, this time we need the button element. So we can say button btn element is equal to get by test ID. So we can get by test ID, and this is, forgot what this was called. I believe it's called add btn. Let's double check. Yes, add btn. Okay, cool. So now we can get it, and now we want to fire an event. Now what event is this going to be? Well, it's going to be a .click event. And essentially, all we really have to pass here is what element that we want to click. Well, we want to click the button. All right, so once we click this, what do we expect? Well, we expect that the counter element is now has a text value of 1, because initially it starts off as 0. When I click this button, it should be 1. Let's actually go to the actual version right over here. Let's change this to 1, which is what it was initially. And when I click this, now this should be 1. So let's go ahead and let's write a test for this. Now before we do this, we actually have to get the counter element. So we can say const counter element is equal get by test ID of what is this called again? Counter, I believe. And now what we can say is we can say that, hey, I expect that the counter element dot text content to be 1. So I expect it to be 1. So we can also have over here that I initially expect it to be 0, and then after I click this button, I expect it to be 1. Again, if I run this test, it is going to completely fail because, well, that functionality isn't doing anything right now. You can see why it fails right now. It's saying, hey, we expected 1, but we received 0. So let's actually go ahead and let's write the exact same test, but for the minus. And this is basically going to be pretty much a copy and paste. So click on the subtract btn subtracts 1 from the counter. And so let's just change this to subtract. And we want to get, well, I guess we can, maybe a better name for this would be add button element. And so let's actually change this over here, add button element, and there we go. And over here this should be subtract button element, and then we can actually go ahead and we can paste this, and over here we expect it to be -1. So let's actually save that. And now if we run this, we can see that now we have 2 tests that are failing. So yeah, 2 tests are failing, and the reason why this one is failing is because, well, we expected -1 and we got 0. So now let's go ahead and let's actually create the logic that makes this thing pass. So let's go about doing that. So this is going to be relatively easy as well. So let's begin with the add button actually, which is over here. So over here we're gonna say, okay, we need an event listener, some on click. We're gonna call a function called add to counter. Okay, so that is the function that we are going to call. So now what we can do is essentially let's add this function. So const add to counter. This is a arrow function, and essentially this is basically going to add. This is going to add whatever the the new counter value is going to be whatever the current counter value is plus the input value. Remember, the input value could be 1, or it could be 100, or it could be whatever. So now let's say that, hey, set counter value to be counter value plus input value. And so now we should see our add actually work. So let's go ahead and do this. So we should see the 1 test pass. And over here you can see that it indeed does pass. So let's actually do another one. So now let's do over here, let's do subtract from counter, and this is going to be minus. And so now let's actually go ahead and let's on click with this over here. So on click, we can basically call this function. And now if we go ahead and run this, our test all should be passing. All right, this is terrific. Now there's another test that we need to implement. What if we went ahead and we changed the value from 1 to something else? Like let's say we changed the value to 7 and then we added it. Now you can see here that it is actually failing. So let's actually go ahead and write this test. And we're going to see that this actually fails, and we're going to see why it fails and how we can fix it. And this is actually a really good way to see why testing is really important. So let's just copy this exact same test. Let's actually copy the add test. And this is going to be, let's make this a little bit bigger. There we go. And so we're going to basically have a similar test where we're going to say change input value and click on add button, or you know what, let's just rewrite the whole thing. So changing input value, then clicking on add button works correctly, let's say. So this works correctly. So what do we want to do here? Well, we have our add button, we have our counter, we also need the input element in this point. So we have the input element, and then we can get by test ID of that specific element. Now what we want to do initially is let's get rid of this other expect. So now we want to fire another event. So this is going to be a change event, and essentially we want to change the input element. We want to change its target, and we want to change its value to, let's say, 5. Now once I change it to 5, I then click on the button and then I expect it to be 5. So let's actually go ahead and save this, and then you can see that this strangely fails. Now you can see here that, well, okay, we expected 5 but we got 055, and if we actually go ahead and do this, well, that's exactly what we get. We have 055. So this is, wow, what is going on here? This is really, really strange. And the reason why this is happening is because over here, what's happening is e.target.value is actually going to be the string of 5. So really what's happening is string concatenation. So we're basically adding 0, the number, to 5, the string. So what it gives us instead is 05, the string. Now the reason why this didn't happen in the initial get-go was because 1 was actually the number 1. And we can actually see that over here. This was actually the number 1. If I change this to the string 5, we can see it would have been 01. So it was initially the number 1. And this is actually why TypeScript is so powerful. This is kind of a form of static testing right over here. But we'll talk about that maybe in a different crash course. Now to fix this, all we really have to do is basically say that, hey, you know, this, we want to parse it as an integer. We don't want to parse it as a string, so we can say parse int, and we can do that similarly. You can do that similarly with the, oh, I think that's it actually. So that's it. So we can just parse it as an integer. And now if I change this to 5, you can see it should be 5, and all of our tests are passing. Okay, cool. So let's actually do essentially the exact same test, but for subtraction. So we have to do this for subtraction as well, for every single test. And the reason why I'm doing these kind of like repetitive tests is because, well, this is really how in a real production application we are going to be testing our app. So let's do subtract. So there's multiple different features. So over here, subtract, and then over here we want to change this to 5 still, but this time we expect it to be -5, and we want to click on the subtract button this time. So if we save this, we should have this test pass. There we go. Okay, now one other thing that we want to test is we want to be able to test, okay, well, we can click on it once and it changes. So let's actually go back over here. So let's say we change this to 5 and we click on it once and it changes. We also want to make sure that if we, you know, click on it again, it changes again. So we can maybe want to click on it multiple times, and then it can change. And sometimes maybe another thing that we would want to test is, hey, if we clicked on this a few times and then we clicked on this a few times, that's something that we want to test. Now we can test that with multiple Fire events. Now I'm not sure if I actually want to go about doing that. Let's actually do it for one, but there's actually multiple different variations of these tests that we can write. So let's go ahead and let's just test that, adding and then subtracting leads to the correct counter number. Okay, so let's quickly do this test right over here. And over here, let's just quickly copy and paste these right here just so we can get our elements. And let's also get the add element, so the add button element right here, our add button element. So over here, we're going to probably want to fire a few events. So the first event, let's say that we want to fire is the change event on the input element. And essentially we want to basically change, this shouldn't be this should be an object. We want to basically change its, I'm missing some parentheses. Let's see. Okay, this should be an object, and we want to basically change its target value to 5, or to 10 this time. And so now let's say that we want to click on the add button 3 times, and then we want to click, or let's say the add button 4 times, and then 2 times on the subtract button. We should theoretically get 20 in this case because we clicked on this 4 times, so we should have 40, and then we basically click on the subtract button twice, so we should get 20. So now we can actually do a bunch of different expects. So we can do something like fire, and then we want to do a click. So we want to do a fire and then dot click, and then we can do something like, well, we want to click the add button. So the add button. And we could also put this in a loop, but for simplicity's sake, I'm just gonna have 4 add buttons and then a few subtract buttons as well. So let's do that. So now a few clicks of the subtract buttons, and then we can say that, hey, I expect that the counter element dot text content to be 20. So we can actually go ahead and execute this, and this passes. Now what we can do is we can actually append a bunch of other expects. So let's say that, now what we want to do is after we do this, let's say we want to change this back to 5, and then we want to execute maybe this over here again. So maybe let's say we want to add it once and then subtract it a few more times. So over here it should be 20 plus 5 is 25, and then minus 5 minus 5, so this should be 15. So we can actually now append another test saying, hey, now I expect this to be 15. So first I expected it to be 20, and then I expected it to be 15. Now with these multiple expects, if any one of them fails, the whole test fails. So if I were to change this to 221, you can see here that the whole test would actually end up failing, and it says, hey, we expected 20, but we got 21. So there we go. That is pretty much that. The absolute last thing that we need to test is basically once we get to over 100, we want the color to be red. So over here you can see here, let's make this 90. So you can see here, or sorry, the color to be green if we're over 100, and if we're under 100, we want it to, or under negative 100, or at negative 100, we want it to be red. So that is the last little feature that we need for our application, and then we are completely done. Now, first of all, we have to think about how we want to implement this. Well, let's actually implement this by having a kind of dynamic class name. So essentially, if a value is over 100, or at 100 or over 100, we're going to give the counter a class name of green. And this is basically going to have a class like this. So let's actually write that down right now. So essentially here we're going to have a class known as green, and essentially it's going to basically have a styles of the color green. And then we're also going to have a class of red, and this is going to have color red. So essentially, if the counter is over 100, at or over 100, we're going to give it this class, or if it's at or under negative 100, we're going to give it this class. So let's actually write a test that basically tests this out right over here. Let's go ahead. So how do we do this? Well, let's do test. Let's say counter contains correct class name. So we can do something like this. So the first thing is we need to get the counter element, of course, after we go ahead and we render our components. So we have to go ahead and render it, and then we have to do const counter element is equal to, well, get by test ID of counter. So this is that. Now initially, let's write a test that basically tests that, hey, this doesn't have anything inside of its class. It's completely empty. So right here, where is this? So our basically our counter should not have anything inside of its class name. It should be completely empty if basically if we initially basically render our component, which is basically, you know, the number is in between negative 100 and 100. So you can basically do something like expect, and we expect that the counter element, and there's a special keyword, dot class name, we can just say to be empty. So now we can actually go ahead and execute this test, and as you can see, everything passes perfectly because, well, initially it is empty. Now let's say that we fire a few events. So let's go ahead and let's change the input value to like 50. So let's change it to 50, and let's go ahead and test that, hey, the input value at this point should still be, or the class name should still be empty, because at this point we're at 50 and we're not over 100 or under negative 100. So this is another test that we can do. And then let's go ahead. Oh, something failed over here. So counter contains correct class name. Oh yeah, so it's saying input element is not defined. That was the error. So let's go ahead and let's just copy that in there because we don't have it in there. So let's go ahead. So so actually what we have to do is we have to change the input element, and then we also have to add or click the button. I actually completely forgot that as well. So let's just copy out the add buttons as well and the subtract buttons. And then over here, what we'll do is after we change the input value, what we can do is we can fire an event, and this event is basically going to be a click event, and then we're going to click on the add btn. All right, so now everything still should be perfectly fine. Now let's say we went ahead and we clicked it again. Now we actually expect this, because now we're at 100. We actually expect this to be green. So we can actually save this event. And then let's say we went ahead and you can see now it fails because, hey, we expected green, but we got nothing. And now let's say we click this on this again. We also expect this to remain green because now we're at 150. So now we can basically test if we continuously increase, is it going to be green or not? And now what we can start doing is maybe we can start clicking on the subtract button. So let's say we click on the subtract button twice, and at this point we should be at 50. So subtract element, oops. Subtract. So at this point we should be at 50. So now what we should expect is basically this to be completely empty. And then let's say we click on this twice more. At this point we're at negative 50. Let's actually click on this 4 more times, so we're at like negative 150. And over here we expect this to be red. So there we go. That is a very long and relatively complicated test. Now this is, again, still failing. And this is because, well, we haven't written out the functionality for it yet. So let's go ahead and let's write out the functionality. The functionality should be relatively easy actually. So let's go ahead over here and we are going to give this a specific class name. So over here, let's give it a class name. And we're just going to give it a class name, and this is going to be with template literals. So we're going to say that, hey, if, so this is going to be with template literals. So we're going to say that if the if the counter value is greater or equal to 100, so if the counter value is greater than or equal to 100, then what we want to do is we want to give you the class of green. Else, we want to give you nothing. Now we can actually do the exact same thing right over here, but now we can basically say, hey, is it less than or equal to negative 100? Then we want this to be red or nothing. So now if we go ahead and we actually save this, that big test is actually passing. So now we can go ahead and you can see here that this actually is working. So now we can, let's change this to 70, 72, now it's green, and then 70 over here, and this is negative. So that is terrific, and that is pretty, oh, this is actually looking at the actual complete version. But as you can see, this version also works as well. So let's actually change this to like 40, and we can see here negative 100. Okay, so awesome. So this is a great introduction. That is pretty much it for this crash course. I hope this kind of makes sense. There's one more thing that I want to quickly discuss, but this is pretty much it. Really, this is all that we're doing with React Testing Library. Now, this is kind of really scratching the bare bones of React Testing Library. If you want to learn more, there's a lot of documentation about testing specific applications, but I think like this is the approach that you're going to be taking. So that is pretty much this. Now, the one last thing that I want to discuss, and we'll discuss this in the next section, is you can see here that there's, for each test, there's kind of a repetitive amount of code. You can see here that here we have a repetitive amount of code. Here we have a repetitive amount of code. So how can we basically kind of alleviate this repetition? We'll get to that in the next section. Okay, so far we have completely finished our test suite, but there's just a little bit of a problem. You can see that before each test, we have essentially this kind of repetitive code right over here. And we want to somehow alleviate this because, well, we want to keep our tests as dry as possible. Now, to do this, what we can do is we can run a specific piece of functionality that runs before each test. And this is actually kind of a special function known as beforeEach. Well, because this is running before each test. And what's great about it is we don't have to import anything. Jest completely understands what this is supposed to do, and it's going to basically execute this before each test. Now, what is it going to execute? Well, inside of it, we are going to create an arrow function that basically contains the logic that it is going to essentially execute before each test. So let's say that now what we can do is we can do something like this. We can basically copy this and just paste it in there, and then we can basically try to get access to the get by test ID element for each test without actually having to render it, because, well, we do it before each test. Now let's actually try to get access to the get by test ID element, so basically our test can look a little something like this. Now the problem with this is right now we can't really access the get by test ID within each test because of, well, JavaScript scoping. This right here is within its own scope, and this right here is within its own scope. So what we can do actually is we can basically do in the global scope something like this. We can say, okay, get by test ID, and then in here what we can do is instead of destructuring, we can say element. So we want the we want the component itself, and then we can say that, hey, get by test ID is equal to the component dot get by test ID function or method. So now what we can do is we can actually completely get rid of this line for each code or each test, because well, we're pretty much doing this before each function, before each test execution. So we can get rid of that. Let's get rid of all of these. And let's get rid of this. And a few more. I think we're done. Okay, cool. So now if we actually go ahead and save this, theoretically, it should still be working, and it is. So over here you can see that the before each is basically a predefined set of code that is going to run before each function. And this is actually a lot more useful than actually keeping our code dry. Let's say we want to test some component, but before we test it, we actually have to, let's say, log in or something of that nature. So maybe what we can do is we can actually add the logic here of logging in. So we can basically, you know, have some sort of event handler that goes on the input and it changes it to a username, and then event handler that changes it to on the input of a password and adds the password. And then maybe we can have an event handler or FireEvent that clicks on the login, and then we're able to specifically test that component. So we can actually fire events. But for now, we'll just keep it simple and we'll just use it to keep our code dry. Now, another thing is there's actually another function known as afterEach. So afterEach is basically a function that runs after each test is executed. And what is actually typically done here is after each, we have this function called cleanup that we can get. And we can actually go ahead and execute this. And essentially what this does is it cleans up all of the DOMs in our React tree that we render after each test. Now what actually happens is that this actually gets executed by default. So we don't necessarily have to specify this. This cleanup gets specified by default if we create a React app. So we don't really have to specify this. Now there's also another one called afterAll. So this is maybe if we want to execute something after all of our tests have ran. So this is another function that we can execute. I don't know if there's a beforeAll. That doesn't really make any sense. I guess there is. So I guess before all the tests are executed, we want to execute something once. So we go ahead and we do the beforeAll. So those are just different features. And that right there kind of summarizes React testing library. I hope this crash course was informative.